right, so thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Project SOS for NetSuite, Real-Time Control over Change Events and Costs. So today we're going to show you our change order IP in action. Quick agenda for today. We're going to give you an overview of app efficiency and Snap-on software and how the two brands interact. We'll walk you through what is a change order, why it's necessary, and how it can impact your business. And then we will walk you through Project SOS, the purpose-built bundle for project-based businesses. And then finally, we'll show you a demo walkthrough of the actual feature in action. So let's talk about our evolution. So Snap-on Software is our new sister brand under the App Efficiency umbrella. And basically, App Efficiency continues to be a top SDN partner and alliance partner known for our job costing expertise, our deep industry knowledge in industries such as ETO, construction, advertising, and more. So that's not changing, but we have launched Snap-on Software. And Snap-on Software lives to deliver software. So it's our new sister company focused on building scalable products. We've got a product roadmap on our website that's live. You can check that out and kind of see where we're going with all of our products and features. Basically, we are focused on building integrated tools with NetSuite. And having the sister brand allows us to innovate faster. We've got an entire team behind it, and it's very, very exciting. So going forward, App Efficiency will remain our consulting service arm, while Snap-on Software will continue to become our product innovation arm. So the same great solution, but just with a sharper focus now. So let me introduce to you our speakers today. So Paul McDonough is our Senior Vice President of Sales and NetSuite Alliances here at App Efficiency. He's been with the company since 2014. He was one of the first employees actually with Johnny, and leads our North American sales and global client strategy. So he has very, very deep NetSuite expertise. Many of you probably already have interfaced with Paul before if you've worked with App Efficiency. He has a sharp eye for business growth, and he's helped shape our expansion across multiple industries and markets. So we're very excited to have Paul. Then we have another App Efficiency employee joining us, Eric Ribeiro. He comes from NetSuite, actually as a solution consultant. He brings over 5 years of hands-on experience with a focus on procure-to-pay and pre-sales. He's known for bridging our technical solutions with real business needs. Eric's actually joining us virtually. He's recorded the demo for us, and we'll walk you through that. So now I'd love to pass it on to Paul to walk us through Project SOS.
Great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Thank you for everybody for attending today. And we're excited to give you an overview of our recent change order management solution. But just to give you some context on, what is Project SOS, and really, as Rebecca alluded to, it's really a complete bundle of solutions that works with for construction, really the construction industry, but there's a number of other industries that it can also provide solutions for, as we see many common footprints across the customers that we work with. But think of it as, from a construction perspective, construction, engineering, land development are all business types and models that can use it. Some of our customers do all of these things in one. And then as far as like who's using the solution, this can come down to, the most obvious, like project managers, but also, whether it be construction managers, superintendents, engineers, costs, anybody that's tracking costs and project accounting can also see this and have visibility into it as well. And specifically within the construction industry, we see a lot of, areas that get into even more granular detail as far as the trades. So whether it be electrical, plumbing, HVAC, framing, concrete work, that sort of thing. We see that, as well as general contractors who might be managing an entire project, and a number of those different subcontractors as well. And so really looking at our ProjectSOS solution and overall, it attacks different areas such as how to manage estimates and ultimately track budgets against those projects. The change order process that typically comes in after that initial budget's created, and that can then lend to a whole host of things that need to be tracked and could lead into other problems that organizations see as well. We can also solve billing needs and then retainage, whether it be on the subcontractor side or the owner customer side too. So a lot of different places in which ProjectSOS has solutions for, and we're really just going to be focused more on the change order piece today. All right, so we'll start with what is a change order and what does this mean? And especially within the construction industry, you can see change orders across different business types as well. But specifically for construction, it's really the change order itself is a formal document. As far as what happens to the change order once it's formalized, that's usually the issue. As far as how do we track it, how do we identify it? So ultimately, though, changes can involve, could be scope additions, scope deductions, so reduction in scope. It could be a change in that could be also correlated to costs or even a schedule. So those are all pieces of managing construction projects, and really beyond that initial estimate and creating that initial project budget, how do we manage these changes? Because they're not an if, it's a when throughout these projects. So the idea is to systemize that process, and without a proper system, then you can run into other business issues such as things like just misunderstandings or miscommunications, budget overruns, project delays, and from a business perspective, billing delays as well. Because if you can't align on what is owed on the project, then that can also lead to other downstream problems. So let's get into what does it matter, and what are some of the problems we're solving here. So when we look at a construction and project team, like a project that's in motion, constant change, a lot of times there's a lot of manual workarounds in managing change orders. So some of what we see are a change order can happen. It's a document and it's filed somewhere, but then nobody actually has access or has visibility into it from a financial perspective, from an organizational perspective. So scope changes then become disconnected from budgets. Because if we're not actually looking at the overall change as additive or deductive to a project budget, then that can create issues downstream as far as performance go. And that gets into our limited visibility into cost, profitability statistics, understanding what's happening in a real-time format. Or let's say a customer even needs to audit a change that happened in a long-term project. Just finding that information can also be challenging without a systemized way of finding it, tracking it, and then visualizing it as well. So some of the things that we see problems are, manual work code entry. So when we're dealing with schedule of values and understanding where the work's taking place, having that visibility in a systemized way is very important. Things that are disconnected. So if the change order process is outside of your core system and it's more of a manual process, that can lead to other problems. And then ultimately that then promotes potential risk as far as financial results as well. So some of the solutions that we've brought to the table with this, and we'll get into more details, is the ability to then, automate data population, track capabilities, and cost data, and then ultimately being able to integrate seamlessly to other areas or transactions within your ERP system. And what we have on the screen now are just some of the new enhancements that we're bringing to the table here around just automated data population. So any automation that we can provide to help with, not only efficiency, but also data accuracy, tracking and visibility, understanding every single change that took place along a project, super important. And then also the flexibility. So as I mentioned earlier, some changes are additive. So we're increasing scope, we're increasing budget. Other changes might be, hey, maybe we need to reduce something that we had maybe thought we needed in scope, but need to reduce it. So both ways, we call them positive and negative changes here. And then how do we then go through an approval process? Some approval processes can be pretty complex, and we need to provide visibility and traceability. And a lot of times at that time, it may not seem like a big deal, but downstream, as far as if I want to understand exactly how did this change get approved, then I have an audit trail. So having that is extremely important. And just how to deal with other things around error handling and cancellation support and that sort of thing, as far as just really the accounting process and helping to automate that as well. So I think now we're going to pivot into showing you some of these things. And as Rebecca mentioned, our solutions are completely built for NetSuite, inside NetSuite. So if you know NetSuite, then this will look very familiar. We've just added some additional capabilities around how to manage change orders. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric now.
All right. So before we start diving into the solution here, I just wanted to take a few minutes to walk through sort of the different types of change orders and how they're typically handled in construction. So whether you're dealing with lump sum work or unit-based pricing or zero cost or internal adjustments or even time and material type contracts, having a clear process is critical. Change orders can have a significant impact, of course, on profitability, project timelines, client relationships. And so understanding sort of the structure and expectations around them is also very key. And so first, I just want to just walk through sort of the different common types of change orders that we typically see and encounter, at least in, with many of our clients that we currently work with and many of the sort of, prospects that come and evaluate NetSuite and Efficiency's product. And so first, I want to talk about lump sum change orders, which are often the most common type when you're working under a fixed price contract. And so in this case, the contract is based really on a defined scope of work and a total project value. So when additional work is requested or when something changes that wasn't in the original contract, you create a change order with a fixed price attached to it. The important part is you need to define exactly what the additional scope is and what it's going to cost, right? And that price is typically submitted for review, it's submitted for approval before the actual work is performed. And a big part of getting that approval is transparency. And so a lot of contracts spell out sort of what the markups or what markups are allowed on change order work. So for example, they might say you're allowed to apply, say, 10% for overhead and 5% for profit. If you're submitting a lump sum change order, it's common to be asked to show your estimated costs broken down by, say, cost type, right? What's your breakdown for labor, your breakdown for material, breakdown for equipment, and how that final number was calculated based on those markups. And it's not always sort of about the money, right? If that change order is going to delay the project and the project schedule, maybe you're adding work that pushes the job back by 2 weeks, that needs to be stated clearly. So you'll want to include, revised dates in the change order so that the expectations are clear and contractually updated. And so next up, another common type of change order that we see in the space are unit cost change orders. So this is where, billing really is tied to units of work. So think linear feet, square footage, number of pieces installed, bundles. So let's say, your contract includes the installation of 500 feet of piping at $10 per foot, but the client needs 100 more feet. So a unit-based change order would simply add the new quantity, say 100 feet, at the original rate of $10 per linear foot. So that's the easiest scenario, but sometimes, additional units might be priced differently, maybe due to location, right, complexity, or even timing, right? Maybe commodity prices have raised, and so ultimately that changes the price per unit. But in that case, right, the change order needs to reflect the revised, per unit rate. And so the goal is to keep the same clarity and transparency you'd have with the lump sum. You spell out what's being added, you understand how it's priced, and whether sort of any timelines or schedules will be affected. And then the third one that we commonly see is the zero cost change order. And so maybe a little bit less obvious than the other two. These don't necessarily change the expected revenue contract value, but they still matter. So these types of change orders are typically used for internal tracking, especially when you're moving, budget or scope between cost codes. So let's say you budgeted $5,000 for cost code 1, but you realize you need to shift that to cost code 2. There's no net increase in, say, cost budget, but you want to create sort of an audit trail for that adjustment. So instead of sort of just editing the budget without any record, you process what we call a zero cost dollar change order to document sort of that movement. So that shows exactly what happened, when it happened, and why it happened. It's a best practice that helps, during audits, helps improve sort of internal accountability as well from your end users, and it makes it much easier to understand sort of your job cost history down the line. And then the other one that I sort of just want to mention, or will mention here, is sort of time and material change orders. It's another very common structure that we typically see, and this is often used when the scope of work is, I would say, more uncertain and hard to define upfront. So let's say you're working under a fixed price contract, but your customer asks for additional work, something sort of outside the original contract, and they want it billed on a T&M basis. That's totally acceptable as long as sort of both parties agree on the terms, right? In a T&M change order, the labor is usually billed at a set hourly rate. Materials are billed at cost or at cost with a markup. So often predetermined again in the contract. But you might have different markups for labor, for materials, right? For subcontractor services. So for instance, it might be 20% on labor, 15% on materials, and then 10% on subs. But these change orders can be beneficial because they offer flexibility and can be processed pretty quickly, right? Especially for sort of urgent or unexpected work. But like all change orders, you still need to establish the rates in writing and ensure you're capturing all the sort of associated costs accurately. So when we think about time tracking, right, material receipts, expense reports, things of that nature, so that ultimately there's a level of transparency that both parties will be happy with. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the solution. And where we're going to start is actually on the project record within NetSuite. And so we're going to view this really through two lenses, through an operational lens, but also through a financial lens. Because it's important to understand sort of how the end user is going to go about their day-to-day to manage, of course, the change order process, but then maybe from more of a PM type role or more executive level role, what type of visibility do we get in the system when we have change order management built into our solution? And so it really starts off with creating a change event, right? And so that change event, really you can think of sort of as the initial trigger. It's the moment you identify that something on the job has changed or needs to change. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk through three different use cases. The first use case really is adding scope to the actual job, right? And so I had mentioned how sort of the change event is the initial trigger. It's the moment you identify that something on the job has changed. And so this could come from a request by the customer. It could come from one of your laborers on site identifying that additional scope is needed, or they heard directly from the client or customer that they want a design revision or they want extra units or whatever the case may be. But a change of scope has ultimately been defined. And we can capture that information in what we call a change event record, right? So this is a potential change, not yet approved or priced. So think of this really as sort of the early flag that something needs to be evaluated. And then ultimately, once we evaluate it, once ultimately we've assessed it, then we can turn that into a quote unquote sort of change order contract. And so for this use case, we're going to talk about sort of adding scope. So these occur again when the customer requests work that wasn't included in the original contract. Maybe it's adding a new feature, right? Extending part of the building, or even addressing sort of an unforeseen, condition on site. You especially see this in residential, renovations or retrofits, where it's really hard to tell how the house was built until you start really tearing down walls and sort of demolishing aspects of that building to sort of uncover what was behind that wall, right? And then ultimately you assess based off of that site condition what work is really needed. And so ultimately, right, when we think about a change event, we have two different types of change events, external and internal. Because we're adding scope, this is identified as an external change event. And this may be new terminology to some folks on the line, but really the difference here is an external change event ultimately is going to change the overall sort of scope that was defined in the original contract. Whereas an internal change event ultimately is just an adjustment to the cost budget that we're tracking internally. So from a customer standpoint, they may not even be aware that there was sort of a cost adjustment from one cost code to another cost code. But for internal tracking purposes, right, we still want that auditability and we still want to be able to trace that change as an internal change event or change order. And then as we scroll down below, what we'll see is now we're getting sort of down into the weeds and understanding sort of where is that impacting our current budget from a revenue and cost perspective. So we can see our work codes and or cost codes defined here, right? We can understand sort of what items or materials that we currently have on this contract. And then as an end user, you then have the ability to add different values depending on how you've priced this out. Have you priced it out based off of a unit rate, right? And so for materials, you might ultimately need to add additional materials to the scope, right? So maybe 5 additional 2x4s or dimensional lumber as an example, right? You can add those units and then ultimately come up with what your expected new budgeted revenue is going to be for those additional units. And then ultimately input what your cost adjustment is based off of the units that you're going to install, right? So in this case, we're going to be installing an additional 5 units for that added scope. The total cost of adding those additional 5 units is around $1,500. And ultimately, this is going to translate into a new contract or a change order contract value of just around $1,800. Right. And one of the great things here is obviously, this is a very simplistic scenario. And so, you may have tens, dozens, hundreds of lines that you ultimately need to change. And of course, we can do that at the line level. But then ultimately, as an end user, you sort of want to understand, well, where do we currently stand? Right? What was sort of the net change? What was the delta? Then ultimately, where are we currently going to be after we incorporate that delta? And so here you can see, it's going to impact our budgeted revenue of around $1,800. It's going to change our cost budget by around $1,500. And so we're going to land at these new values. Now, one of the great things about the solution is ultimately, right, we want to build in controls in the system, whether that's approval workflows or whether it's controlling what users can and cannot enter. When we're thinking about sort of just change events and ultimately generating that change order in the system, we can have these ultimately go through approval workflows, right? And this is where our solution is natively built into NetSuite. We leverage all the native NetSuite records and tools and reports and reminders and alerts so that folks don't always have to drill into records specifically, right? Many folks like to work off of dashboards, right? Visualization tools to help them get work done, right? Lead them to where they need to ultimately accomplish things, right? So in this case, we can come to our home dashboard, right? So this is my home dashboard within NetSuite, and we can see that I have proposed change events in my reminders portlet. So this is going to alert me to change events that either need review and ultimately may need approval, right? So I can come in here and ultimately change the status of this after sort of reviewing in detail what has been changed. But from a high level, right, we can sort of see the summarized impact of those potential change orders in the system. So we're very much integrated into the NetSuite platform, right? Understanding, yes, we need operational workflow, but how does that operational workflow lead into action, right? And so we want people to be able to action through that change order process, through their dashboards, through their reminders, through alerts, so they can be more proactive and less reactive, right? And then ultimately, once we approve this change event, you can see you also have that audit trail, right, on when records were created, right, when they were adjusted, when they were edited. But ultimately, once it's been approved, it will automatically create, right, that new change order contract in the system. And similarly, right, and this is more of a business process decision, you can then have that change order go through a second step of approval, where ultimately you can, again, review depending on, again, level of complexity. You can review the lines on that change order or pending approval change order, and then ultimately have that go through an additional approval step. But you can see it automatically transposes all the information that we captured in that sort of initial trigger called a change event, and ultimately transposing that information on the actual change order record itself, where we can see those respective revenue amounts and that expected cost amount by that specific cost type and work code. Okay, so that's use case one. Now, the second use case I want to walk through is really talking about adding scope, but also, scope reduction. Because we know sort of in construction, as much as scope is added, we know scope also gets reduced. And that could be for a myriad of different reasons. And this is going to be, again, through sort of the lens of, unit-based pricing. But again, this could be through the lens of a lump sum type contract as well, where it's not necessarily unit priced or unit based, but more just a change in values per work code or schedule of value and or cost code. And so when you're working on a unit-based contract, right, change orders often come in two forms. Again, added scope or reductions, both tied to quantity. For added scope, the customer may ask you to perform more units of the same work, right? So in this case, we're going to add 20 additional units of labor, right? Maybe it's hourly labor for a specific, in this case, type of design. And so, you'll add those additional units to that change event. And then oftentimes, they're agreed upon the same rate that was agreed upon during the original contract, right? So unless sort of new conditions justify a different price. But on the flip side, right, a reduction change, which we see here, right, occurs when the scope is sort of scaled back. Maybe fewer units are needed than originally planned, right? So that change order reduces both not only the quantity you're seeing here, but also the expected revenue and the expected cost. So in either case, really the key is keeping everything clear and traceable, right? You're going to update the quantities. They'll reference the original unit rates, which you can see here, or sort of any negotiated adjustments, and always get sort of formal approval before applying the changes to your budget or billing, right? And one of the great features of NetSuite is you can always add additional context as needed, right? Capturing them in different fields. So you can see here in the memo field, the client requested a revision of the design layout after initial submission. And then we can attach documents to these records to ensure that we're capturing sort of that breadcrumb trail and that paper trail of all the different files that were attached and agreements or scope changes or reductions in scope that were agreed upon between us and the customer or client themselves, right? And so similar idea process, this ultimately goes through an approval process. Once this change event is approved, it then creates the respective deductive change order as well as that new change order for that additional scope of work. And so you can see here that translates again automatically once that change event has been processed, and it's going to capture those respective amounts per work code cost type, whatever sort of your dimensionality is there, right? And so this is an example of that change in added scope. And then this is going to be an example of that reduction of scope, right? Where we're don't need as many units of this specific piece of material as we initially had anticipated. Okay. So that's use case two. And now the last use case I wanted to walk through is really use case three. And so for this use case, this is going to be that zero cost change order. So not all change orders sort of impact expected revenue contract value. A zero cost change order is used when we're simply moving budget dollars from one cost code to another. So maybe we overestimated for one cost code and need to shift funds to another cost code. So even though the total contract amount stays the same, it's still important to document this adjustment, right? So creating a zero cost change order provides that, again, clear audit trail that shows when, why, and how the budget was reallocated. And so this is best practice for internal transparency and project control, right? It sort of avoids confusion later and ensures that forecasting, job costing and reporting all stays accurate. And so we can see here in this example, again, we've defined this time as internal. Again, this is not going to have any external impact to our client, to our customer, but for internal cost budgeting purposes, right, we need to be able to make those adjustments so we have that audit trail. And then as we scroll down below, you can see those changes that we made for our cost budgets to these respective cost codes and or cost types. And you can see we're removing cost budget from the design work code and ultimately moving it to our mechanical installation cost code. And you can see the delta remains 0 simply because we're moving, really just a set amount from one cost code to another cost code. So you treat this with the same discipline as a standard change order, just without the revenue pricing impact. And again, similar to before, right? This can ultimately go through an approval process. You can see this is in a proposed state. So you can again have that same navigational path, user and end user experience where ultimately they get notified via alerts or reminders on their dashboard that this ultimately needs review. Okay. And so operationally, right, having a structured change order process is critical, right? It ensures that sort of any modifications to scope, cost, or schedules are properly documented, they're properly approved, right? And they're communicated not only internally, but externally as well. This keeps, your project on track and protects your margin. But just as important as the process itself is the ability to report on it, right? And so this is where I sort of want to sort of end the demo portion of it. So without reliable change order reporting, you're sort of flying blind. So you may not know how many change orders are outstanding, right? What stage they're in, how they're impacting your project budget or how long they're sitting unapproved. And that's a big risk, right? Not just financially, but also for client relationships and project forecasting. So here's an example of a report, but you're always going to be able to have that breadcrumb trail and sort of, paper trail within the system to understand any change events that were proposed and approved, any change orders that you have against that job and or project. And then from a sort of a 30,000-foot view, you can see the impact that it has on the actual job or project itself. So we can see what our original contract was from a revenue perspective. You can see the impact of any change orders that had an impact, right? Any additional scope that we added in the total value of that, and ultimately where we currently sit from a total revenue contract perspective. But then we also see the other sort of side of the coin and understanding how those change orders impacted our cost budget as well. One of the great things about NetSuite with our tool and with our solution is you can see this at multiple different layers. And so this is through the project, sort of high level lens, but then we can parse this down into different dimensions or categories where if you remember when we're looking at change events and change orders, how we can, definitely get more deeper into the details and understand how it's impacting different cost codes and or cost types. So this is through sort of the lens of viewing our budget versus actuals from a cost code or work code perspective, where you can see again from a change order perspective how it's impacting those respective work codes and or cost codes. And so from an operation standpoint, right, reporting gives you visibility into trends, right? Are certain customers or jobs driving most of your change activity? Are specific PMs potentially slower in getting approvals? Are change orders causing schedule delays or billing gaps? And it's really not just for project managers, right? Executives, finance, accounting folks, field teams, they all sort of need their own individual insights or respective insights. But reminders, as I showed earlier, showing your pending change orders or pending change events, or reports showing like this one, approved change orders broken down at various levels really helps teams stay proactive instead of reactive. And so, a strong change order process keeps you compliant, but strong reporting keeps you in control, right? And so it's the combination of both is what gives construction teams, true operational visibility and better business outcomes. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and transition back into PowerPoint. And before I pass it back to the team here, I just want to quickly talk about sort of best practices. And so in your system, right, whether you're using, spreadsheets, or whether you're using NetSuite or some other tool, or really any construction ERP, it's critical to sort of mirror the structure of these change orders in your digital process. And so, now that we've sort of had a look at how the system handles change orders, I want to shift gears for a few minutes and talk about sort of real world best practices and common challenges that come up when sort of managing change orders in construction. And so let's start with the challenges. One of the biggest challenges we see is sort of an unclear project scope in the initial contract. And so when the initial contract is vague or it's incomplete, it naturally leads to more change orders, often for things that should have been identified and priced up front. But we all know, it's nearly impossible to avoid changes entirely, but the more you can define and document early, right, the less disruption you'll face sort of down the road. And so that sort of leads us to the second major challenge, not having a consistent or standardized change order process. Sometimes companies have no formal process at all. More often each project manager handles it a little differently. One PM may track everything in a spreadsheet, another may use email threads, and someone else might rely on verbal approvals. That kind of inconsistency creates confusion, not just for internal teams, but also for clients, right? Subcontractors, but also auditors and executives. So a key takeaway is this, right? It's not just about having a process, it's about having everyone follow the same one. So standardizing how change orders are introduced, right? How they're priced, how they're documented, how they're approved across the company really helps keep things organized and reduces, costly oversights. Timing is also very important, right? The sooner a potential change is identified and raised, the better, right? Early visibility gives everyone time to assess sort of the impact on budget and timeline and to agree on how to proceed before work actually starts. The last thing you want is to complete extra work and hope for reimbursement later without documentation. And, speaking of documentation, verbal agreements aren't enough. It's okay to get a verbal green light to keep the project moving, but that should always be followed up with a written confirmation and a signed change order. That signed document protects both parties and ensures expectations are aligned. But if we sort of get back to the actual contract itself, it's essential to review the change order language in every contract before signing, right? Look for sections that dictate sort of how changes must be submitted, what backup is required, what markup is allowed. If you're on the receiving end of a contract, that's your opportunity to really negotiate fair terms before you're locked in. And a best practice here is to assume there will be change orders because there are almost always are, and to align on the process ahead of time. If you wait until the first change comes up to discuss how it should be handled, you're sort of already behind. Also, don't agree to scope changes without approval, right? While construction often demands, flexibility, and yes, sometimes work begins before paperwork is finalized, there still needs to be a traceable record, even if it's just documenting a verbal approval via email, while, the formal change order is routed for signature, that audit trail does matter. And then it's also mindset, right? Approach change orders with a positive professional attitude, right? Keep the dialogue open with owners, general contractors, or subs. Stand firm on, protecting your rights, but don't turn the process into sort of a battleground, right? That's where sort of a structured, respectful approach always builds long-term trust. And then finally, right, equip your team with the right tools, right? Change orders happen frequently, so you should have sort of reusable templates ready to go. If you're managing multiple jobs, using different formats or ad hoc documents, that all wastes time and increases sort of the risk for error. And so ideally, you're using a solution like NetSuite with Snap-on software that not only tracks change order status, but also ties them directly into your project budget, right? Billing. You can use generic tools and they all have their place, but they're not designed with sort of construction workflows in mind. A system that sort of understands the life cycle of a change of a project from standing up your project, your contract, identifying that change, having an approval workflow in place all the way through billing. It's what truly sort of enables proactive project management. And so with that, I want to pass it back to the team here. All right. So before we start diving into the solution here, I just wanted to take a
Okay.
few
Thank you,
minutes to
everyone,
walk through sort of the different.
oops, for staying with us through that demo. So I hope that that provided some good insights into the new features in the product. So thank you, Eric, for recording that for us. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it back to Paul to cover some highlights of the demo and just tie things up for us.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. And this just a few things here just to highlight as far as these change order capabilities. And I think I alluded to it earlier, and then Eric in his demonstration, really looking at a streamlined approach to change order management. So you have a system that's tracking the changes. You're able to then provide visibility into the changes and that sort of thing, as well as all the approvals that you would need to manage those changes. So it's really not only tracking them, putting them in a common place and having a common process across the organization, but then also managing how do we deal with approvals? What does that structure look like? Smaller companies, it might be more informal, but you still want to track and audit approvals. For larger organizations, there might be a multi-level parallel path type of approval capabilities. So those are things that we just leverage the NetSuite platform that our tool is built on to manage that as well. Other things, just managing these things efficiently, easily, and then having that reporting stack above it is super important, as Eric demonstrated as well. Key thing here is if there are other variations of reports that are necessary, we're leveraging all of the NetSuite reporting functions within the system because you are in NetSuite. So that's one of the advantages here. So you can take our reports, extend them, modify them, attach them to alerts, attach them to data monitoring tools and that sort of thing as well. And it's just getting into some other features or possibilities. Again, this is these are all things that we can do with all of our tools, but specifically on change orders, we can do some bulk processing. So think of this as automation. If you want to import a template through a change order through a CSV, then that is all possible as well, fully supported. And then really managing, how are they created? So whether we import a bunch of them, whether we use the user interface, whether we copy something that's already there, all of that fully supported within the system. And then really leveraging some of the NetSuite automation tools for scripts and workflows on top of the change order to really facilitate the process. So obviously, it all depends on how complex your change order process is, the volume of process, how many users are interacting with the system. But you can go from a very simple design to something that's very complex, fully supported through the design of our change order management tool. And I think
Awesome.
I'll hand it back to Rebecca. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. That was great. So now I just want to give some time for any questions that the audience might have. I see we have a couple in here, but if you do have a question, please pop it in the Q&A section and I'll get to it there. So Paul, our first question here is this just for construction teams or can other industries use it too?
Right, that's a great question. And I think when folks think of change orders, you naturally think of some kind of construction company, because that's something that construction companies work with every day, day in and day out. But I look at this where these tools can be used for any type of project services that are being delivered. So whether you're managing projects that are physically building things, whether you're managing projects that are providing services to your customers where changes can occur, then you can absolutely use this tool. And then we can leverage all of the NetSuite capabilities as far as if we need to change some terminology and that sort of thing for another industry, it can all be done that way. So we built the framework and then it can easily be extended to all kinds of different, whether it be micro verticals within the construction space or across anything that's project services oriented.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Paul.
Sure.
Another question we have is, will this work for both adding new work and removing work?
Adding work and removing work, adding material, removing material, adding equipment, removing equipment, all of the above. So it's really, we look at this as a, when you think of a change order, oftentimes you might naturally think, well, I'm increasing something, whether it be from a revenue or material perspective, but the flip side can occur as well. So this solution accommodates both of those scenarios. And through that change event, it's really establishing what that change event looks like. And then from there, it's linking it to the appropriate transaction in NetSuite that then can, be tracked against for reporting or job costing or whatever need that's required there.
Okay, that's great. Last question here. Can I cancel or fix a change order if something goes wrong?
So yes, the quick answer is yes, absolutely. You can cancel, change, modify. There's also maybe some process questions you need to ask yourselves as an organization as well, if the change order went through an approval process, maybe it's a different person that has to manage any kind of exception. So part of this just comes down to, the system can definitely do it, and then it comes down to defining the processes and think of it as segregation of duties as far as who's responsible to do what. So that's the idea behind it, but absolutely can be supported.
Okay, amazing. Thank you, Paul. Thanks for answering those couple of questions. So again, thank you to the audience for joining us today on this change order webinar. And thank you, Paul, for walking us through what a change order is, why it's important, and then kind of tying up our demo.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks everybody that attended.
Thank you. And just a quick note, if you do have a prospect where you think change order could be a good fit, please reach out to us, either softwaresales@efficiencyinc.com or prospects@efficiencyinc.com, and we will put you in contact with the right person and we'll start the conversation. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.